Some betrayals cut so deep they leave scars on entire communities. Some secrets are so dark they demand the ultimate price to keep them buried. And sometimes, the person you trust most becomes the very one who destroys everything you've built. This is the story of a murder that shocked a quiet Kentucky town. A crime so calculated and cold-blooded that it would leave investigators questioning everything they thought they knew about love, greed, and the length someone will go to protect their lives. It was 5 a.m. on May 17, 2005, when the emergency call shattered the morning silence in Alexandria, Kentucky. A woman's voice, frantic and breathless, screamed into the phone about an intruder who had broken into her home and shot her husband. The call cut off abruptly with the sound of crashing glass, leaving dispatchers scrambling to reconnect as they sent every available unit racing through the quiet streets of Campbell County. When police arrived at the rustic log cabin nestled deep in the woods south of Alexandria, they found a scene that would haunt them for years to come. The house looked like a war zone, drawers yanked open, belongings scattered across floors, shattered glass glinting in the early morning light. And in the master bedroom, they discovered the body of Robert "Bob" Bosley, a successful businessman who had built an empire from nothing, now slumped lifeless beside his bed, his dreams and ambitions silenced forever by 6 brutal gunshots. At first glance, it appeared to be a robbery gone horribly wrong. The obvious signs of a break-in, the chaos throughout the house, the broken rear door, it all seemed to tell the story of a desperate criminal who had invaded this peaceful home and taken a man's life in the process. But as investigators began to dig deeper, something felt terribly wrong. The pieces didn't fit together the way they should, and the more they uncovered, the more they realized they were dealing with something far more sinister than a random act of violence. Bob Bosley's story began like so many American success tales, with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. Born on August 2nd, 1962, in the small town of Alexandria, Bob grew up in a religious, tight-knit family that instilled in him the values of hard work and integrity. Even as a young man, he possessed an entrepreneurial spirit that set him apart from his peers. While others his age were content with regular jobs and modest ambitions, Bob had a vision that burned bright within him. He wanted to build something substantial, something that would last. Starting with nothing more than basic tools and an unshakable work ethic, Bob began offering chimney cleaning and small roofing repairs to his neighbors. Day after day, he climbed onto roofs and crawled through narrow spaces, his hands growing calloused and his reputation growing stronger. His prices were fair, his work was impeccable, and his friendly demeanor made customers feel like they were dealing with family rather than just another contractor. Word spread quickly in the small community, and what started as a one-man operation slowly began to grow. Over the years, Bob's small service business transformed into Bosley Roofing and Chimney Sweep of Alexandria, a thriving enterprise known throughout the region for quality, efficiency, and reliability. The company's success exceeded even Bob's wildest dreams, generating impressive profits that allowed him to expand his vision even further. With money flowing in steadily, he began purchasing rental properties, eventually owning around 20 investment properties that amplified his income and positioned him as one of the area's most successful businessmen. Success brought with it the lifestyle Bob had always dreamed of. He embraced luxury with the enthusiasm of someone who had earned every penny through sweat and determination. Sports cars gleamed in his driveway, horses grazed on his property, and an airplane sat ready to take him anywhere his business or pleasure demanded. But perhaps his most famous indulgence was his boat, a magnificent vessel that became legendary on Lake Cumberland for the wild, adult parties he hosted aboard it. These gatherings, filled with music, alcohol, and scantily clad guests, became the stuff of local legend and cemented Bob's reputation as someone who worked hard and played even harder. It was at one of his favorite local restaurants where Bob's life took a turn that would ultimately lead to his destruction. There he met Amy Pave, an 18-year-old local girl who seemed as different from his usual party companions as night from day. Amy had been born in 1969 into a working-class family that struggled with financial limitations and the challenges that came with her father's battle with alcoholism. Despite these obstacles, she had refused to let her circumstances define her future. Amy was determined to break the cycle of struggle that had defined her family's life. After graduating high school with top honors in 1986, she pursued business studies at a local community college connected to Northern Kentucky University. To fund her education, she worked as a waitress, serving tables with the same determination that had carried her through her academic success. It was in this role that she first encountered Bob Bosley, and their meeting would change both of their lives forever. Bob was older, wealthy, and possessed a charisma that drew people to him like moths to a flame. At first, Amy was reserved around this successful businessman who seemed to inhabit a world so different from her own. But gradually, she found herself drawn into his orbit. She began attending his notorious lake parties, initially as just another guest, but slowly becoming a regular fixture in his inner circle. What started as casual encounters evolved into something deeper, and Amy discovered that she had captured the heart of one of the region's most sought-after bachelors. Their relationship grew serious over 4 years of courtship, and when they finally married, it represented the ultimate transformation for Amy. She had gone from her modest roots to marrying a man who could give her everything she had ever dreamed of: financial security, social status, and a future free from the struggles that had defined her childhood. For Bob, Amy represented something different from the party scene that had dominated his social life. She was intelligent, educated, and shared his appreciation for the finer things in life, while maintaining the values that had been instilled in her during her upbringing. Soon after their marriage, the couple began building their family. Their daughter Morgan was born in 1996, a beautiful child who became the apple of her father's eye. 3 years later, their son Trevor completed their family, and Amy transitioned from the carefree party girl who had once danced on Bob's boat to a devoted mother who threw herself into the role with the same determination she had shown in everything else she pursued. Her wild nights on Lake Cumberland were replaced with school functions, parent-teacher conferences, and the countless activities that come with raising children. Bob continued to expand his business empire and investment portfolio, but one aspect of success frustrated him immensely: the administrative side of running a company. Managing payroll, dealing with taxes, handling invoices, and coordinating with contractors felt like a burden that kept him chained to an office when he preferred the freedom of the lake or the satisfaction of hands-on work. Weekends often saw him disappearing aboard his boat, sometimes for days at a time, refusing to disclose his whereabouts to anyone, including his wife. Friends who knew Bob during this period later recalled that he seemed to be drifting away from his family responsibilities, drawn back into the life of indulgence and secrecy that had characterized his bachelor days. Some sources even suggested that Bob and Amy had developed an understanding about their marriage that allowed for certain freedoms, though the truth of their relationship remained known only to them. What was clear was that Bob was looking for ways to escape the parts of business ownership that he found tedious and constraining. The solution seemed obvious when Bob realized that Amy's business education made her the perfect candidate to handle the company's financial and administrative responsibilities. Since she had studied business administration and had proven herself to be intelligent and capable, he asked her to take over the aspects of the company that he found most burdensome. At first, Amy seemed hesitant about taking on such significant responsibilities, but eventually, she agreed to manage the company's books, payroll, and tax obligations. From the outside, the arrangement appeared to be working perfectly. The business continued to boom under Amy's careful management, and the Bosley family seemed to be living the American dream. They resided in their rustic log cabin nestled in the woods, a temporary home, while their true dream house was being constructed on a nearby plot of land. This sprawling estate would feature 14 acres of carefully landscaped grounds, complete with stained glass windows, a stone tower, and even Gothic gargoyles that reflected Bob's taste for the dramatic and unique. To their community, the Bosleys embodied everything that hard work and determination could achieve. They were attractive, successful, generous with their time and resources, and deeply involved in their church and their children's school activities. Bob often donated his services to low-income families who couldn't afford necessary repairs, and his name was respected throughout Campbell County as someone who had never forgotten his humble beginnings or the community that had supported his rise to success. But like so many fairy tales, the Bosley story had a dark side that remained hidden from public view. Amy's role as administrator had given her complete access to the company's financial picture, and with Bob distracted by business expansion, his lake activities, and a massive dream house project, she began making decisions that would ultimately destroy everything they had built together. Instead of paying the company's substantial tax obligations, Amy quietly began diverting those funds into a personal account that only she could access. This embezzlement wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a small theft born of desperation. It was a systematic, calculated scheme that continued for years. Month after month, Amy diverted hundreds of thousands of dollars that should have gone to the Internal Revenue Service, all while maintaining the facade of a devoted wife and responsible business manager. The missing tax payments went unnoticed for far longer than they should have because Bob trusted Amy completely and had little interest in the financial details she had agreed to handle. But even the most careful criminal eventually faces the reality that no one can avoid the IRS forever. The Internal Revenue Service had been tracking the company's missing tax payments with a methodical persistence that made them one of the most feared agencies in the federal government. They issued repeated letters demanding explanations and payments, made countless phone calls to the business, and even attempted to schedule face-to-face meetings with Bob to resolve what had become a massive debt of over $1.7 million. The problem was that Bob never received any of these warnings or communications. Amy had arranged for all IRS correspondence to be delivered to a private mailbox that only she could access, effectively cutting off all contact between the government and her unsuspecting husband. She was well aware that the federal agents were closing in and that their patience was running out, but perhaps in her desperation she believed she could continue stalling indefinitely, or maybe she was already forming the terrible plan that would soon shock an entire community. Everything began to unravel on the morning of Tuesday, May 17, 2005, just days before Bob and Amy's 15th wedding anniversary. The IRS had finally lost patience with the missing payments and evasive tactics, and they had scheduled a mandatory meeting with Bob for that very morning. Federal agents were prepared to confront him about the massive debt and demand immediate explanations and payment arrangements. For Amy, this meeting represented the end of everything: exposure of her crimes, the destruction of her marriage, criminal charges, and almost certain imprisonment. The frantic 911 call that came in around 5 a.m. seemed to tell a straightforward story of home invasion and murder. Amy's panicked voice filled the phone line as she described an intruder who had broken into their home and shot her husband before fleeing into the woods. The call was suddenly cut off by what sounded like crashing glass, adding to the sense of chaos and terror that seemed to surround the crime. When law enforcement officers arrived at the scene, they found Amy in apparent shock, clutching her children close to her as she tried to comfort them in the aftermath of the traumatic experience. Her sister quickly arrived to take Morgan and Trevor away from the scene, while Amy was brought to the police station for initial questioning. The officers secured the crime scene and called in specialized units to process the evidence and search the surrounding forest for any trace of the alleged intruder. At first light, additional officers joined the search using K-9 units and even a helicopter to scour the dense woods around the Bosley cabin. They were looking for any sign of a fleeing suspect, footprints, disturbed vegetation, abandoned weapons, or any other evidence that might lead them to Bob's killer. But as the hours passed and the search continued to yield nothing, investigators began to have doubts about the story they had been told. Inside the bedroom where Bob's body was discovered, the scene was both horrific and puzzling. Bob was found kneeling beside the bed, slumped forward with multiple gunshot wounds that had ended his life in the most brutal way imaginable. Yet despite the violence of the attack, only 2 shell casings were found in the room, a detail that would prove crucial to understanding what had really happened that night. The rest of the house told a story that seemed designed to support Amy's account of a burglary gone wrong, but the more closely investigators examined the evidence, the more questions arose. Kitchen cabinets stood wide open, including the ones beneath the sink, a strange place for any thief to search for valuables. The rear door had a broken window that could have served as a point of entry, but the distribution of glass fragments raised immediate red flags. Most of the shattered pieces were found outside the house rather than inside, which was inconsistent with someone breaking in from the exterior. The bathroom had been ransacked as well, with the mirrored medicine cabinet hanging open and prescription bottles scattered across the floor. Throughout the house, the scene looked more like carefully staged chaos than the aftermath of a panicked intruder's quick search for valuables. If the attacker had fled as quickly as Amy claimed in her 911 call, why was there evidence of such extensive searching and destruction? During her initial questioning at the police station, Amy appeared appropriately shaken and distraught, though investigators noted that her emotional displays seemed somehow hollow. She described her attacker as a white male with a nasal voice, bad breath, and a distinct odor of urine, details that seemed almost too specific for someone who had encountered an intruder in the dark during a terrifying attack. She displayed 2 small marks on her chest that she claimed were injuries from struggling with the intruder. When detectives asked who might have wanted to harm Bob, Amy suggested that her husband wasn't universally liked in the community. She painted a picture of a man whose wild reputation and business success might have created enemies among disgruntled employees or competitors. She specifically mentioned Noah Heim, a contractor and longtime friend of Bob's, claiming that he had recently argued with her husband about work-related issues. But Noah was quickly eliminated as a suspect when investigators verified his solid alibi for the night of the murder. More importantly, friends and colleagues who knew both men described their relationship as strong and positive, with no evidence of the kind of serious conflict that might lead to violence. Noah was genuinely devastated by Bob's death, and his grief appeared completely authentic to everyone who spoke with him. Meanwhile, panic spread through the Alexandria community like wildfire. The thought that a dangerous killer was loose in their quiet town terrified residents who had never imagined such violence could touch their lives. Schools were closed for several days as parents kept their children home and neighbors struggled to reconcile the brutal murder of Bob Bosley, a man known throughout the area for his generosity and kindness. With the peaceful community, they thought they knew. Back at the cabin, investigators continued their methodical search for evidence that might lead them to the truth. The mystery of the missing shell casings gnawed at them. If Bob had been shot multiple times, where were the other casings? The answer came when they expanded their search to include the basement area of the home. There, inside the family's washing machine, they made a discovery that changed everything about their understanding of the crime. Soaked clothing sat in the washer, and at the bottom, carefully wrapped in a folded cloth, were 4 additional shell casings. The implications were staggering. Why would a fleeing killer take the time to hide evidence in the victim's own washing machine? What possible reason could an intruder have for concealing shell casings in such a specific location? The discovery made no sense if Amy's story was true, but it fit perfectly with a very different narrative that was beginning to form in the investigators' minds. Even more puzzling was the aluminum baseball bat they found nearby, bearing fresh scratches and a white residue that would require laboratory analysis to identify. The bat's presence raised additional questions about the timeline and nature of the attack, particularly when considered alongside the broken rear door and the distribution of glass fragments that had initially caught the investigators' attention. For the moment, Amy was released and allowed to reunite with her children, but the evidence was beginning to paint a picture that bore no resemblance to her account of the crime. The scene appeared to have been carefully staged, with valuables including stacks of cash left completely untouched, hardly the behavior of a desperate burglar willing to commit murder. Amy's emotional displays, while dramatic, seemed to lack the genuine grief that investigators would expect from a woman who had just lost her beloved husband in such a traumatic way. The breakthrough came when staff members from the Internal Revenue Service visited the police station after learning about Bob's death through news reports. They revealed that they had been trying for months to contact Bob regarding a massive unpaid tax bill that had grown to over $1.7 million. Even more significantly, they had scheduled a mandatory meeting with him for the morning he was found dead, a meeting that would have exposed the full extent of the missing payments and demanded immediate explanations. The IRS agents also shared a detail that sent chills through the investigation team. During previous attempts to contact Bob by phone, they had spoken to someone who claimed to be him, but the voice was obviously artificial, high-pitched, and clearly unnatural, as if a woman was attempting to disguise her voice to sound like a man. That voice, they now realized, had belonged to Amy Bosley, who had been intercepting their communications and attempting to stall their investigation while she figured out how to handle the growing crisis. With this revelation, the motive for Bob's murder became crystal clear. Amy, entrusted with managing the company's finances, had systematically embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars by diverting tax payments into her personal account. Bob, who had no knowledge of what was happening, was about to discover the truth when IRS agents confronted him with evidence of the missing payments. For Amy, that meeting represented the end of everything she had built: her marriage, her lifestyle, her freedom, and quite possibly her children. Additional investigation revealed other pressures that may have contributed to Amy's desperate decision. Bob's alleged extramarital affairs, which his sister later confirmed, had created additional strain in their marriage. She recalled overhearing Amy say that if Bob ever cheated on her or tried to leave her, she would shoot him. At the time, everyone assumed it was just an expression of anger or frustration, but in light of recent events, those words took on a much more sinister meaning. Despite the mounting evidence against her, Amy continued to maintain her innocence during a second interrogation. She insisted that she loved Bob despite their marital problems, acknowledging that they had their difficulties but claiming that was normal for any couple. She adamantly denied that she would ever harm the father of her children, painting herself as a devoted wife and mother who had been victimized along with her husband. But the physical evidence told a very different story. Ballistics testing confirmed that all 6 bullets that had struck Bob matched the 6 shell casings that investigators had collected, 2 from the bedroom and 4 from the washing machine. The systematic way the evidence had been hidden and the careful staging of the crime scene suggested a level of premeditation that was both chilling and calculating. Perhaps the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source: Bob and Amy's own children. When investigators interviewed 9-year-old Morgan and 6-year-old Trevor separately, both children gave identical accounts of what they had experienced that night. They had gone to sleep peacefully in their beds, only to be awakened by the sound of 6 gunshots. Then, after the shooting had stopped, they heard the sound of glass breaking. This timeline directly contradicted Amy's version of events, which placed the breaking glass before the gunshots. If an intruder had broken in through the rear door and then shot Bob, the children should have heard the glass breaking first. Instead, their testimony suggested that someone inside the house had fired the shots and then broken the glass afterward, exactly what would be expected if the crime scene had been staged to look like a break-in. Even the scratches on Amy's chest, which she had presented as evidence of her struggle with the intruder, proved to be suspicious under closer examination. The marks were too symmetrical and controlled to be the result of a violent struggle, appearing more like self-inflicted wounds designed to support her story. Furthermore, examination of her blouse revealed that it hadn't been torn during any kind of attack. It had been carefully cut with scissors and then ripped to create the appearance of damage from struggle. Less than 2 weeks after Bob's murder, authorities had gathered enough evidence to arrest Amy Bosley and formally charge her with her husband's homicide. One crucial piece of evidence was still missing: the murder weapon itself. But that gap was soon filled when a pistol from Bob's own extensive gun collection was discovered. The exact circumstances of how the weapon was found remain disputed, with some accounts claiming it was hidden in Amy's handbag behind a wardrobe, while others suggest it was found later by Amy's sister while sorting through her belongings. Regardless of the specific details surrounding its discovery, ballistic testing confirmed that the gun matched the shell casings found at the crime scene and in the washing machine. The bullets recovered from Bob's body were too damaged to provide a definitive match, but the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Amy had used one of her husband's own weapons to kill him, adding another layer of betrayal to an already horrific crime. As Amy's trial began, prosecutors presented a narrative that was both clear and damning. For years, they argued, Amy had been systematically stealing from her husband's company, diverting tax payments into her personal account, while keeping Bob completely unaware of what was happening. She had managed to keep the IRS at bay through mail redirection and deception, but her luck had finally run out when federal agents demanded a face-to-face meeting with Bob. On the morning of May 17, 2005, With her husband scheduled to meet with IRS agents who would expose her crimes, Amy had devised a desperate plan to eliminate the one person who could identify her as the source of the missing money. The prosecution argued that she had likely sedated her children beforehand to ensure they would sleep through the initial stages of her plan. Then, while Bob slept peacefully beside her, she had quietly retrieved one of his firearms and stood over him in the darkness. The first shots wounded Bob, but didn't kill him immediately. According to investigators' reconstruction of the crime, he awoke and tried to stop his attacker, but when he realized that the gun was in Amy's hands, shock and disbelief may have paralyzed him long enough for her to finish what she had started. The trajectory of his wound suggested that he had lunged toward his attacker, perhaps in a desperate attempt to disarm her, only to discover too late that the person trying to kill him was the woman he had trusted with everything. Stunned, bleeding, and betrayed by the person he loved most, Bob couldn't overpower Amy before she fired the fatal shots. By the time the violence ended, the man who had built a fortune from nothing and trusted Amy with both his business and his heart lay dead in the home they had been building for their future. The woman who had once stood by his side now stood accused of orchestrating his execution, motivated not by fear or passion, but by cold, calculating greed. After killing her husband, Amy had implemented the rest of her plan with the same methodical precision that had characterized her embezzlement scheme. She used the aluminum baseball bat to shatter the rear door, creating the appearance of a break-in. She tore through cabinets and drawers throughout the house to simulate the chaos of a burglary, all while being careful not to disturb anything of real value that might tempt an actual thief. She wrapped 4 of the 6 spent shell casings in a cloth and hid them at the bottom of the washing machine, hoping that investigators would assume the intruder had fled with his weapon and wouldn't search for additional evidence. To make her own injuries appear credible, Amy carefully cut her chest with scissors and then slashed her blouse to simulate the damage that might occur during a struggle with an attacker. Finally, she called 911 with a performance that would have been worthy of an award if it hadn't been part of such a calculated crime. Her voice was perfectly frantic, her story contained just enough detail to seem credible, and her apparent terror seemed genuine to the dispatchers who received her call. But like so many aspects of Amy's plan, the 911 call would ultimately become evidence against her rather than supporting her claims of innocence. Forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed the true story behind Amy's theatrical performance. Lab tests confirmed that glass fragments found on the aluminum baseball bat matched the broken rear door, and the bat was positively identified by her own children as belonging to their family. No footprints were found outside the house. No vehicle tracks suggested the presence of a fleeing intruder, and no physical evidence supported the existence of anyone matching Amy's description of her alleged attacker. Meanwhile, investigators had uncovered the devastating truth about the Bosley marriage that Amy had worked so hard to keep hidden. Photos retrieved from the couple's personal safe, taken during the wild parties on Lake Cumberland, revealed that Bob had indeed been living a double life that included at least one confirmed extramarital affair. While this betrayal may have provided additional motivation for murder, the evidence made it clear that Amy's primary concern was financial rather than emotional. Amy's secret embezzlement had grown to nearly $2 million over the years she had been diverting tax payments from her husband's company. The IRS meeting scheduled for the morning after Bob's murder would have exposed everything, destroying not only Amy's freedom, but also the comfortable lifestyle she had worked so hard to maintain. In her twisted logic, killing Bob would bury the secret along with her husband, allowing her to use his remaining assets to cover the debt while keeping the rest of the stolen money for herself. But the children's testimony about the sequence of sounds they heard that night, gunshots first, then breaking glass, had destroyed Amy's carefully constructed timeline. Even though the defense argued that there were no eyewitnesses to the actual shooting and that the bullet casings could theoretically have been dropped from Bob's own pockets, after a visit to the shooting range, the accumulated evidence painted an unmistakable picture of premeditated murder. Still, Amy's attorney maintained that there was enough ambiguity in the case to create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. There was no DNA evidence directly linking Amy to the shooting, and the bullets recovered from Bob's body were too damaged to provide definitive ballistic matches to the weapon. With skilled representation and a bit of luck, they argued, Amy might be able to avoid conviction on the most serious charges. Faced with the possibility that Amy might escape justice entirely, and unwilling to force the Bosley children to testify against their mother in open court, prosecutors offered a plea deal that would spare everyone the trauma of a lengthy trial. In exchange for a guilty plea that would spare her children the ordeal of testifying about their father's murder, Amy would receive a reduced sentence while admitting her guilt to the world. On November 2, 2006, Amy Bosley entered a Campbell County courtroom wearing a green and white prison jumpsuit, her demeanor unreadable as she faced the consequences of her actions. Before sentencing, Bob's family was given the opportunity to address her directly, and their words carried the weight of grief, anger, and profound loss that would stay with everyone present for years to come. Bob's brother James called Amy a liar and a fraud, warning her that while she might one day enjoy freedom again, she would never escape the memories of what she had done. He reminded her that every night for the rest of her life, she would see Bob's face in her dreams and remember the tears of the children she had orphaned through her selfish actions. His words carried the raw emotion of a family destroyed by betrayal and greed. Deborah, Bob's sister, stared directly at Amy as she asked the one question that haunted everyone who had known and loved Bob. Did he beg you to stop? The courtroom fell silent as Amy sat motionless, unable or unwilling to provide an answer that might have offered some small measure of closure to the family she had devastated. That silence spoke volumes about the coldness that had allowed her to kill the father of her children while they slept nearby. Perhaps the most heartbreaking moment came when Bob's mother, Audrey, took the stand with trembling hands to read a letter filled with grief over a final goodbye that had never come. Her words painted a picture of a son who had been generous, loving, and devoted to his family, whose life had been cut short not by a stranger's violence, but by the calculated cruelty of someone he had trusted completely. Amy sat silent throughout the emotional testimony, her eyes fixed on the floor as she wiped away tears that seemed hollow given the magnitude of her crimes. The judge, bound by the terms of the plea agreement, acknowledged the devastating damage Amy had inflicted not only on her husband, but on her children, her community, and her own future. He sentenced her to 20 years in prison, noting that under Kentucky law, she would become eligible for parole after serving 85% of her sentence. That meant Amy would spend at least 17 years behind bars, finally paying the price for her years of deception and her ultimate act of murder. On May 17, 2022, exactly 17 years after Bob's murder, Amy Bosley, then 54 years old, walked out of the Kentucky Correctional Institution for Women and back into a world that had moved on without her. Most news outlets barely noted her release, and her current whereabouts remain unknown to the public. Some who follow the case believe she may have gone in search of the millions she had once siphoned away from her husband's company, money that was never fully recovered despite extensive investigations. As for Bob, his final resting place is St. Stephen's Cemetery in Campbell County, Kentucky, where he lies as a man remembered for his generosity, ambition, and devotion to family. He was a person who had built something meaningful from nothing, who had trusted the woman he loved with both his business and his heart, only to be cut down by that very trust. His story serves as a tragic reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from strangers in the darkness, but from the people we hold closest to our hearts. Amy's actions seemed both tragic and senseless in hindsight. She wasn't destitute when she made the decision to kill her husband. She was living in luxury and comfort that most people could only dream of. Bob wasn't cruel or abusive, by all accounts. He was a generous man who had given Amy everything she could have wanted. The IRS, despite their reputation for ruthlessness, might very well have worked out a payment plan or settlement that would have allowed the family to preserve much of their wealth and lifestyle. If Amy's true motive had been revenge for Bob's infidelity, a divorce might have left her significantly richer and completely free to start over with someone new. But instead, she chose murder, destroying not only Bob's life, but her own future and traumatizing her children in ways that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Her decision represented the ultimate triumph of greed and selfishness over love, family, and basic human decency. The Bosley case stands as a chilling reminder that the capacity for evil can lurk behind the most ordinary facades. Amy had been respected in her community, active in her church, involved in her children's schools, and trusted by everyone who knew her. Yet beneath that carefully maintained exterior was someone capable of systematically stealing millions of dollars from her husband's company and ultimately killing him to cover up her crimes. Justice was served in the end, though it could never truly balance the scales for what Amy had taken from the world. Bob Bosley's life, his dreams, his love for his children, and his trust in the woman he had married were all destroyed in a few moments of calculated violence. The 17 years Amy spent in prison represented a fraction of the lifetime of love and experiences she had stolen from her husband, her children, and everyone who had cared about Bob. The old saying that nothing is certain except death and taxes proved prophetic in Amy Bosley's case. Both came knocking on her door, and when she tried to avoid one, she ended up facing both. Her story serves as a warning about the corrupting power of greed and the devastating consequences that can follow when someone believes they can outsmart the system and escape the consequences of their actions. In the end, Amy Bosley's carefully constructed life of luxury and respect collapsed in a single night of cold calculation, leaving behind a shattered family, a stunned community, and a legacy of betrayal that will never be forgotten. Justice may have been delayed, but it was not denied. And while the wounds inflicted by her crimes may never fully heal, there is some measure of peace in knowing that she finally paid the price for destroying so many lives in service of her own selfish desires. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. If you haven't already, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. We upload new true crime content daily, covering cases you know and many you don't. Stick with us as we bring you more stories that deserve to be heard. See you in the next video.